On the morning of September 14th, 1851, Ezra Tunstall stood in the parlor of his father's farmhouse outside Harlan, Kentucky, and listened to his brothers divide the world without him. The room smelled of tobacco and old pine. Rain tapped at the warped window glass, and through it Ezra could see the east pasture, 160 acres of bottomland stretching toward the Clover Fork, rich and dark as coffee grounds. That land had fed Tunstalls for 3 generations. Now his eldest brother Morris was tracing a line across the hand-drawn survey map with his thick finger, carving the earth into halves. "The bottomland splits clean between me and Dalton," Morris said. He did not look at Ezra. "The house and barn go with the east parcel. The west gets the mill rights and the timber stand." Dalton, the middle brother, nodded slowly. His wife, Harriet, stood behind him with her arms crossed. She had been whispering into Dalton's ear for weeks, ever since their father, Silas Tunstall, had been lowered into the churchyard, and her whispers had hardened into this moment. "And Ezra?" said the family lawyer, a thin man named Creech, who kept adjusting his spectacles as though he could not quite bring the scene into focus. Morris exhaled through his nose. "Ezra gets the mountain parcel, 40 acres on the north slope of Black Ridge." A silence followed. Even Creech looked uncomfortable. Everyone in Harlan County knew what the Black Ridge parcel was. A steep, rocky hillside, thick with laurel and chestnut oak. Too sloped for planting, too remote for timber hauling. There was no road to it, no water source anyone had found. Their father had won it in a card game 20 years earlier and never set foot on it again. "That land won't keep a goat alive," Dalton muttered, and Harriet's thin lips curled into something that was not quite a smile. Ezra said nothing. Ezra. He was 31 years old, the youngest of the 3, lean and quiet, with hands that were always stained with something: ink, wood oil, creek mud. Where Morris had inherited their father's bulk and Dalton their father's ambition, Ezra had inherited something less visible, a restless, patient curiosity that made him take things apart just to see how they worked. He had read every book in the county lending library twice. He could build a chair that would outlast the man who sat in it. But none of this translated into the language his brothers understood, which was the language of acres and bushels and dollars. He looked at the map one more time. The Black Ridge parcel was shaded in pale cross-hatching, like the surveyor himself had been embarrassed to include it. "I'll take it," Ezra said. Morris blinked. "You're not going to argue. Would it change anything?" Morris said nothing, which was answer enough. Ezra folded the deed into his coat pocket and walked out into the rain. He spent the next 3 days packing. He did not own much: a chest of tools his father had given him on his 18th birthday, a canvas rucksack, a cast-iron skillet, 2 wool blankets, a 20-pound sack of cornmeal, a pouch of salt, and a wooden crate of books that included volumes on natural philosophy, mineralogy, an agricultural treatise by Liebig, and a dog-eared copy of Lyell's Principles of Geology that he had read so many times the spine was held together with twine. He also took one of the farm's 2 mules, a stubborn gray animal named Bishop, which Morris agreed to part with only because the mule had a habit of kicking at the barn door and had once bitten Dalton on the shoulder. The night before he left, Ezra slept in the barn. Not because anyone had told him to, his old room was still his, but because the house no longer felt like a place where he belonged. He lay in the straw loft and listened to the horses breathing below him and the September crickets singing in the pasture. And he felt not sadness exactly, but a hollowing out, as though something heavy had been removed from his chest, and the space it left was tender and strange. On September 18th, before dawn had fully broken over the Clover Fork Valley, Ezra loaded Bishop and began the 7-mile climb from the valley floor to Black Ridge. He left no note. There was nothing to say that the deed in his pocket did not already say. The trail, such as it was, disappeared after 3 miles. Ezra spent most of the afternoon cutting through laurel thickets with a hand axe, leading Bishop by the halter over shelves of mossy sandstone. The ridge was steeper than he remembered. His boots slipped on wet leaves. Twice he had to unload Bishop and carry the packs himself around deadfalls that blocked the way. By late afternoon, the slope leveled somewhat, and Ezra came into a saddle between 2 rocky knobs where chestnut oaks grew wide and old. The forest canopy was thick here, filtering the gray light into a kind of permanent twilight. Below him, the Clover Fork Valley spread out in a quilt of fields and woodlots, the farm buildings tiny as toys. Above him, Black Ridge continued to rise, a dark wall of sandstone and shale. He tied Bishop to a poplar and began to walk the property line, counting his paces, noting what he saw. The slope was brutal. The soil, where it existed at all, was a thin crust over broken rock, but the timber was old and straight, and there was sign of deer and turkey everywhere. It was near the top of the parcel, where the ridge flattened into a shelf of exposed sandstone, that Ezra found the opening. It was not large, perhaps 4 feet wide and 3 feet tall, half concealed by a curtain of wild grape and Virginia creeper. A cool breath of air sighed from it steadily, carrying the mineral smell of deep stone. Ezra crouched and peered inside. Darkness, but the air that flowed over his face was remarkably warm for September, and when he extended his hand into the opening, the warmth intensified. He knew what this meant. He had read about it in Lyle, the constant temperature of deep earth, the way caves maintained a steady warmth in winter and coolness in summer. But reading about it and feeling it were different things entirely. He crawled inside. The passage was narrow for the first 10 feet. He had to move on his belly, pushing his shoulders through a gap in the rock that scraped his coat. But then the ceiling rose and the walls fell away, and he found himself standing in a chamber large enough to hold a team of horses. His lucifer match flared to life and threw dancing shadows on walls of gray limestone streaked with russet and cream, a ceiling that arched overhead like the nave of a small church, and a floor of packed clay that was dry and firm beneath his boots. Water had carved this room over millennia. He could see the scalloped marks on the walls where ancient flows had eaten the stone. But the cave was dry now, the water table having dropped long ago. The temperature was astonishing. Outside, the September air carried the first sharp chill of autumn, and Ezra had been sweating in his wool coat from the climb. In here, it felt like a warm kitchen on a Sunday morning. He unbuttoned his coat and stood still, letting the warmth settle around him like something physical. He lit a second match and walked deeper. The cave extended back into the ridge for what he estimated was 60 feet before narrowing into a low passage he could not follow without crawling. Along the walls he found shallow alcoves and natural shelves of stone, some of them smooth as though they had been sanded, others bristling with small calcite formations that glittered in the matchlight. The ceiling was blackened in places. Someone, at some point in the distant past, had built fires here. Cherokee, perhaps, or earlier peoples whose names were lost. The soot was old and hard, part of the rock now. The air moved constantly, a gentle draft flowing from the deep passage toward the entrance, carrying the scent of minerals and time. Ezra stood in the darkness after his last match guttered out, and felt that warm breath pass over him, steady as a sleeping animal's. And he listened to the silence, which was not truly silence at all, but the deep, patient hum of stone and earth and the slow drip of water somewhere far back in the mountain's interior. He knew, in that moment, what he was going to do. The first weeks on Black Ridge tested everything Ezra had. He built a lean-to shelter at the cave entrance using chestnut poles and bark slabs, which gave him a dry place to store his tools and provisions while he worked on making the cave habitable. The work was hard and solitary. He cleared the entrance of vegetation, squared the opening with a hand chisel so he could later fit a door frame, and began the painstaking work of leveling the cave floor. The clay subfloor was forgiving. He could cut it with a spade and tamp it flat. But the rocks were another matter. Some were loose rubble he could carry out by hand. Others were embedded in the floor like teeth, and he had to split them with hammer and wedge before prying them free with a bar. His hands blistered, then calloused. His back ached each morning. But the cave repaid his labor with comfort. Even on the coldest October nights, when frost silvered the oaks outside, the interior held steady at what he estimated was near 55 degrees. He built a door frame of squared oak timbers and hung a plank door with leather hinges. He chinked the gaps with a mixture of clay and dry grass. He built a sleeping platform along one wall, raised a foot off the floor to take advantage of the warmer air that collected near the ceiling. At night, wrapped in his wool blanket on that platform, he was warmer than he had ever been in the drafty farmhouse below. But warmth alone would not feed him. Ezra spent his first autumn hunting and foraging. The ridge teemed with game. White-tailed deer came to browse the chestnut mast, wild turkeys scratched through the leaf litter, and squirrels were so plentiful they scolded him from every tree. He shot a buck in late October and hung the carcass from an oak limb to cool. That night, lying on his platform, he had an idea. The cave's steady temperature and constant airflow, that gentle draft flowing from the back toward the entrance, created conditions he recognized from something he had read in a treatise on food preservation. The cool, moving air would cure meat slowly and evenly, without the risk of spoilage that plagued conventional smokehouses in variable weather. If he could introduce smoke at the back of the cave, the natural draft would carry it forward over the meat and out the entrance, creating a perfect slow smoking chamber. The next morning, he tested the theory. He built a small fire of green hickory in an alcove near the back of the cave and hung strips of venison from wooden pegs he had driven into cracks in the ceiling near the entrance. Within minutes, the thin blue smoke drifted forward on the cave's natural breath, flowing over the meat in a steady, even current before curling out the door. The temperature was key. A conventional smokehouse ran hot, often above 120 degrees, which cooked the meat as much as cured it, and required constant tending to prevent flare-ups or uneven heating. But the cave's thermal mass absorbed the fire's heat and regulated it. The smoke that reached the hanging meat was warm, but not hot. Ezra estimated perhaps 70 to 80 degrees, and the airflow was so consistent that every strip received the same treatment. After 4 days, he cut down a piece and tasted it. The venison was unlike any smoked meat he had ever eaten. It was tender, deeply flavored, with a complexity that came from the slow, even cure. Hints of hickory and something else, a faint mineral quality he attributed to the limestone walls. The texture was firm, but not dry, the color a deep, translucent red-brown that shone when he held it up to the light. He hung the rest of the buck and began experimenting. That first winter was the proving ground. November brought freezing rain that sheathed the trees in glass and made the trail a cascade of ice. December buried the ridge under 2 feet of snow. January was worse, a brutal cold snap that locked the mountains in stillness for 3 weeks, the temperature dropping so low that the sap in the chestnut oaks cracked like rifle shots in the night. The trail to the valley became impassable for weeks at a time. Ezra survived on venison, dried corn he had bought in town before the snows, wild persimmons he had gathered in October and stored in a natural cold shelf near the cave entrance, and hickory nuts he had collected by the bushel and cached in a stone-lined pit. The solitude was immense. For days at a time, the only sounds were the wind in the bare trees, the occasional call of a crow, and the steady sigh of the cave's breath at his back. He talked to Bishop. He talked to himself. He read Lyle by firelight until he could recite passages from memory, and he filled the margins of the book with his own observations about the cave's geology, the layering of the limestone, the fracture patterns in the ceiling, the mineral staining that told the story of ancient water flows. But the cave itself was a revelation. While his brother's farmhouse, which Ezra knew from 30 years of living in it, leaked heat through every crack and required constant stoking of 2 fireplaces to remain bearable, the cave held its temperature like a stone jug holds water. The thick limestone walls, he understood now, acted as thermal mass, absorbing warmth during the day and releasing it slowly through the night. The principle was the same one that kept European wine cellars at constant temperature. The earth itself was the insulator, and 50 feet of solid rock was more effective than any wall man could build. He kept a rough thermometer he had fashioned from a glass tube and spirits of wine, calibrated against the freezing point of water, and recorded the temperature each morning and evening in a notebook. The cave interior never dropped below 53 degrees, even when the outside air plunged to 4 below zero during the January cold snap. When he built a small fire for cooking, just enough to heat his skillet and boil water for coffee, the temperature climbed to the mid-60s and held there for hours after the fire died. The stone remembered warmth the way good soil remembers rain. The smoking experiments continued through the winter with growing sophistication. He smoked wild turkey, which took on a rich golden flavor that deepened over days of slow cure. He smoked squirrel, which was surprisingly delicate. He tried rabbit, which he found too lean for good smoking, and bear from a young black bear he took in late November, which produced a dark, intensely flavored meat that was almost too rich to eat alone, but extraordinary when sliced thin and paired with cornbread. He experimented with different woods. Hickory produced the deepest, most complex flavor, a warm, nutty smokiness that permeated the meat thoroughly. Sassafras root gave a subtle sweetness, almost like root beer, that worked particularly well with wild game. Applewood from a wild tree on the south slope imparted a fruity, delicate quality that was extraordinary with turkey. Oak was dependable, but plain. Green cedar, he discovered, was disastrous. It produced a bitter, resinous taste that rendered the meat inedible. He recorded everything. He discovered that the cave's natural humidity, steady at what he estimated was around 70%, was ideal for the slow cure. Too dry, and meat became jerky, tough, and tasteless. Too wet, and mold crept in, white at first and then green, ruining weeks of work. But the limestone sweated just enough moisture to keep the air balanced, and the constant airflow prevented the stagnation that bred spoilage. It was as though the cave itself had been designed for this purpose, or rather, as though the conditions that preserved meat were the same conditions that the earth naturally maintained in its interior, and all Ezra had done was recognize the convergence. By February, he had more smoked meat than he could eat in a year. The town of Harlan was 7 miles down the mountain, a cluster of timber buildings around a courthouse square where farmers and merchants traded on Saturdays. Ezra had avoided it through the autumn and winter, unwilling to endure the looks and whispers he knew would follow the youngest Tunstall, the one who got the worthless ridge. He had heard, through the hunter who occasionally passed near his camp, that people in town talked about him with a mixture of pity and amusement. Poor Ezra, living in a hole in the ground like a bear. Morris and Dalton said he'd gone simple in the head. But in early March of 1852, when the trail cleared enough to lead Bishop down without risking a broken leg on the ice, he packed a canvas sack with 20 pounds of smoked venison and turkey and walked to town. The sky was hard blue and the air smelled of mud and snow melt and the first faint promise of spring. He found the general store first. Amos Fletcher, who ran it, was a practical man in his 50s who had known the Tunstall family for decades and had the good sense to judge a man by what he produced rather than what people said about him. He looked at the smoked meat with professional skepticism, turned a piece over in his hands, examined the color and texture, then cut a thin slice with his pocket knife and chewed it slowly. He swallowed, cut another slice, chewed that one even more slowly, his eyes narrowing. "This is from that cave of yours," he said. It was not a question. "It is." Fletcher cut a third slice and held it up to the window light. The meat was a deep amber red, almost translucent at the edges, with fine threads of fat running through it that had rendered into something silky during the long cure. "The color alone tells me something different happened to this meat. I've been selling smoked venison for 20 years, and I've never seen this color." "The cave temperature stays constant," Ezra explained. "The smoke moves slow and even. The meat never gets too hot or too cold." Fletcher nodded as though this confirmed something he had tasted. "How much of this do you have?" "I can supply 20 pounds a week through spring," Ezra said. "More in autumn when the hunting picks up." Fletcher offered him 12 cents a pound, 3 times the going rate for common smoked meat, and asked if he could have some by the following Saturday. Ezra agreed and walked out with $2.40, enough to buy salt, cornmeal, coffee, a spool of heavy thread, and a new axe head. Word traveled the way it does in small mountain communities, not through announcements, but through the accumulation of small remarks, each one adding to the next, like stones in a wall. Fletcher mentioned the meat to his wife, who mentioned it to the preacher's wife, who mentioned it to anyone who would listen. A farmer named Hoskins tried a piece at Fletcher's counter, bought 2 pounds on the spot, and told everyone at the Saturday horse auction that it was the finest thing he had ever put in his mouth. By late April, Ezra was supplying not only Fletcher's store, but 2 other merchants in Harlan, and a boarding house on the Lexington Road had begun ordering 10 pounds a week for its table. The proprietress, having discovered that travelers who ate the smoked turkey at breakfast invariably mentioned it to other travelers they met on the road. The money was modest, but steady. More importantly, it gave Ezra the means to improve his operation. He bought tools he needed: a proper draw knife, a crosscut saw, and a barrel of nails. He began the slow work of expanding the cave. The limestone was softer than it appeared. Using his hammer and chisel, Ezra found he could cut into the walls at a rate of roughly 6 inches per day, carving out new alcoves and extending the main chamber. He worked methodically, squaring each new section, saving the cut stone blocks for building. Over the spring and summer of 1852, he expanded the main smoking chamber from its original 20 feet of usable length to nearly 40, and carved out a separate curing room, a smaller chamber off the main passage where he could hang meat at a lower temperature for weeks-long cures. He also solved the smoke problem. His initial method, an open fire at the back of the cave, worked, but it was inefficient and left soot on the ceiling. He built a proper firebox of cut limestone blocks, mortared with cave clay, with a flue channel carved into the floor that directed the smoke low along the ground before it rose to the hanging meat. This gave him control. He could regulate the smoke's temperature and density by adjusting the firebox draft, and the low channel design meant the smoke contacted the meat only after it had cooled and dispersed evenly. That summer, a man named Josiah Blunt rode up from Cumberland Gap. Blunt was a pork buyer for a packing house in Cincinnati, and he had heard about the Tunstall meat from a merchant in Middlesboro. He was a large man with shrewd eyes, and he spent 2 hours in the cave, examining everything: the firebox, the flue, the hanging racks, the curing room. He tasted the venison, the turkey, and a new experiment Ezra had been working on: smoked pork loin, cured for 3 weeks in a salt and molasses brine before going into the cave. Blunt ate 3 slices of the pork without speaking. Then he sat down on a stone ledge and looked at Ezra with an expression that was part admiration and part calculation. "I've been buying meat for 18 years, he said. "I've eaten smoked pork in Virginia, Tennessee, Missouri, and Ohio. I have never tasted anything like this." He explained what made it different. Conventional smokehouses were above-ground structures, subject to temperature swings that could range from 40 degrees on a cold night to 130 on a sunny afternoon. This inconsistency produced uneven cures, meat that was dry on the outside and raw in the center, or that developed off flavors from bacterial growth during warm spells. Ezra's cave eliminated these problems entirely: the constant temperature, the steady airflow, the natural humidity. It was, Blunt said, as close to a perfect smoking environment as he had ever encountered. "The limestone does something to the flavor, too," he added. "I've heard of cave-aged cheese in Europe. Same principle. The minerals in the air, the bacteria in the stone, they contribute something you can't replicate in a wooden building." Blunt offered a contract: 200 pounds of smoked pork per month, delivered to the railhead at Cumberland Gap at 20 cents per pound. It was more money than Ezra had ever imagined earning from 40 acres of rocky hillside. He accepted. The contract with Blunt changed everything, and it changed nothing. The money was good, $40 a month, a sum that would have startled his brothers. But the work was the same patient, methodical labor Ezra had been doing since the day he crawled into the cave. He now needed a reliable supply of pigs, which he arranged with 2 farms in the valley who were glad to sell him animals at market price. He built a pen on the flatter ground below the cave entrance and a stone-lined spring house where he discovered a seep that provided a steady trickle of cold water, enough for the pigs and for his own needs. The brine recipe evolved through experimentation. Salt was the foundation, 2 pounds per gallon of water, but Ezra added sorghum molasses for sweetness, cracked black pepper, dried sage from the ridge, and a small amount of saltpeter, which he obtained from a natural deposit he found deeper in the cave system. Saltpeter, potassium nitrate, was a traditional curing agent, and the cave produced it naturally through the action of bacteria on the limestone in the presence of organic material. Ezra recognized it from his reading and confirmed it by its taste and crystalline structure. Each batch of pork spent 14 days in the brine, then was rinsed, dried for a day in the curing room, and hung in the main smoking chamber for 3 to 4 weeks, depending on the size of the cuts. The hickory smoke was applied intermittently, 4 hours on 8 hours off, a rhythm Ezra had developed through trial and error that produced the deepest penetration of flavor without overdrying the surface. He kept meticulous records. Every batch was numbered. He noted the weight of each piece before and after curing, the brining time, the smoking schedule, the cave temperature, the outside weather. He recorded which wood produced which flavors and in what combinations. His notebooks, he filled 3 in the first 2 years, became a detailed manual of cave smoking technique, written in a precise, unhurried hand. In the spring of 1854, a woman named Clara Dietrich appeared in Harlan. She was 27, the daughter of a German cabinet maker who had settled in Louisville and died of cholera the previous year, leaving his family with debts and a workshop full of unsold furniture. Clara had come to Harlan to live with an aunt while she determined what to do with her life. She was small and sharp-featured, with dark hair she wore pulled back in a practical bun, and she had inherited 2 things from her father: his skill with wood and his refusal to be impressed by anyone who hadn't earned it. They met at Fletcher's store on a Saturday in April. Ezra was delivering his weekly supply. Clara was buying nails and a length of ash for a chair she was repairing. She noticed his hands first. The same kind of calloused, capable hands her father had possessed, with the particular thickening of the fingertips that comes from years of gripping tools. And then the quality of the wooden rack he had built to transport the meat, which was dovetailed at the corners with a precision that spoke of care and an understanding of wood grain. "You made that yourself," she said. It was not a question. "I did." "The joinery is German." Ezra looked at her, really looked, which was something he did not often do with strangers. She was examining the dovetails with the practiced eye of someone who understood what she was seeing, tilting the rack to catch the light, running her thumb along the joint line to feel for gaps. There were none. "My father had a book on Bavarian woodworking," he said. "I taught myself from the drawings." Clara nodded, as though this confirmed something she already knew about the kind of person who would teach himself joinery from drawings, and went back to selecting nails. But as she left the store, she paused at the door and said, without turning around, "The ash grain on that rack runs the wrong way for a carrying piece. It'll split if you drop it." She was right. He rebuilt the rack that week with the grain running lengthwise. They spoke again the following Saturday, and the Saturday after that. Their conversations were brief and practical, about wood species, about the properties of different finishes, about her father's belief that shellac was superior to varnish for indoor furniture, about Ezra's experiments with walnut oil as a waterproof coating for his outdoor structures. But the conversations carried an undercurrent of recognition, the way 2 people who speak the same rare language find each other even in a crowd. Each Saturday, the conversations grew a little longer. Each Saturday, Ezra found himself thinking about what he would say the next time, rehearsing observations about his work that he thought might interest her, then discarding the rehearsal and simply speaking honestly when the time came. Because dishonesty, even the small dishonesty of rehearsed spontaneity, felt wrong in her presence. In June, Ezra invited her to see the cave. She considered the invitation for a full minute, which he later learned was her way. Clara did not make decisions quickly, but she made them firmly. She rode up the mountain on a borrowed horse the following Tuesday, and he showed her everything: the smoking chamber, the firebox, the curing room, the notebooks, the thermometer readings, the way the smoke traveled its slow, steady path from the back of the cave to the light. She examined the stonework with the critical eye of a craftsman's daughter, ran her hand along the walls, and spent a long time studying the natural draft. watching the smoke travel its patient path from firebox to entrance. "You've built a living machine," she said. "The cave does most of the work. You just had the sense to let it." It was the most perceptive thing anyone had said about what he had accomplished, and he felt something shift in his chest, some load he hadn't known he was carrying. They were married in October 1854 in the small Methodist church in Harlan. Clara moved into the cave, which by then Ezra had expanded into 3 connected chambers, with a proper plank floor in the living quarters, a stone hearth, and a window he had cut through 2 feet of rock to let in morning light. She brought with her a set of her father's cabinet-making tools, a trunk of books in German and English, and a disposition that was equal parts tenderness and iron. The years that followed were years of building. Clara proved to be not merely a partner, but a collaborator whose skills complemented Ezra's own. Where he thought in terms of stone and smoke, she thought in terms of wood and design. She built shelving systems for the curing room that doubled the hanging capacity. She designed a ventilation door, a hinged wooden panel with adjustable louvered slats that gave them precise control over the airflow without compromising the cave's thermal stability. She kept the business records in a leather-bound ledger, her handwriting as clean and exact as her dovetail joints. In 1856, their first child was born, a boy they named Silas, after Ezra's father. The following year came a daughter, Annette. The cave home grew with the family. Ezra carved out a 4th chamber for the children, and Clara built bunks and a toy chest of cherry wood that was so beautifully crafted, Fletcher offered to buy it for his store. The smokehouse business expanded steadily. By 1858, Ezra was processing not only pork, but also beef, venison, and wild game for customers across 3 towns, Harlan, Middlesboro, and Cumberland Gap. He employed 2 young men from the valley to help with the butchering and hauling, and he began teaching them the techniques he had developed. The smoked meat had acquired a reputation that traveled by word of mouth along the mountain roads and river routes, carried by teamsters and peddlers and boarding house keepers who served it to travelers and then answered questions about where it came from. It was during this period that Ezra's brothers began their decline. Morris, the eldest, had invested heavily in a hemp operation that depended on slave labor. When the political tensions of the late 1850s disrupted markets and made credit scarce, he found himself over-leveraged and undersold. He mortgaged the east parcel to a bank in Lexington and spent the next 2 years trying to keep ahead of his debts. Dalton fared worse. Harriet's ambitions had driven him to expand the mill beyond what the local demand could support. He built a larger structure, bought expensive machinery from Pittsburgh, and then watched helplessly as the creek that powered the wheel dropped to a trickle during the drought of 1859. The new mill sat idle for months. Creditors came. Ezra heard about these troubles the way he heard about most things, from Fletcher, who told him without embellishment and without satisfaction. Ezra listened, nodded, and said nothing. He did not visit his brothers or offer help, not because he wished them harm, but because he understood that their troubles were the fruit of choices they had made freely, just as his own success was the fruit of his. He did, however, send a ham to Morris's wife at Christmas. It was returned unopened. The war came in 1861, and it tore Harlan County in 2. Kentucky's neutrality was a fiction that lasted barely 4 months. Families split along lines that had nothing to do with geography and everything to do with conviction, old grudges, and economic interest. Men who had traded horses on Saturday were shooting at each other by Wednesday. Churches divided. The courthouse was occupied twice, once by each side. Ezra's Ridge, remote and difficult to reach, became a kind of accidental refuge. The steep trail, the the dense laurel, the absence of any road wide enough for a wagon, all the things that had made the Black Ridge parcel worthless to his brothers now made it invisible to armies. Ezra continued to smoke meat, and he supplied both Union and Confederate sympathizers without discrimination, a neutrality that was commercial rather than political, but that nonetheless kept him alive in a county where men were being shot for choosing the wrong side. Fletcher, who was quietly Unionist, once asked Ezra where his sympathies lay. "With the hogs," Ezra said. "They don't care about politics, and neither do I." It was not entirely true. He cared. He cared about the boys from the valley who marched off in homespun uniforms and came back in pine boxes, and about the farms left untended, and about the widows and orphans who had done nothing wrong except live in a place where other men had decided to fight. But he had learned, long before the war, that caring and choosing sides were different things, and that a man who kept his hands busy and his mouth shut could sometimes do more good than a man with a musket and a cause. The cave proved its worth in new ways during the war years. Its constant temperature kept meat safe during the hottest summers, when above-ground smokehouses failed and provisions spoiled within days of curing. Its remote location made it nearly impossible for foraging parties to find. The few soldiers who stumbled close to the ridge were turned around by the terrain before they came within a mile of the entrance. And its stone walls were impervious to the fires that destroyed barns, mills, and outbuildings throughout the county in the waves of retaliatory burning that marked the war's ugliest chapters. Clara managed the business during the periods when Ezra was away, helping neighbors rebuild after raids, serving on the county's informal relief committee, cutting and hauling timber for families whose fences had been torn down for firewood by passing troops. Once, in the bitter winter of 1863, she sheltered a family of 11 whose farm had been burned. Mother, grandmother, and 9 children ranging from an infant to a boy of 14, feeding them from the Smokehouse stores for 6 weeks until arrangements could be made. The cave home, carved from solid rock, warm and dry and hidden from the world's violence, became a place people sought out when they had nowhere else to go. Clara turned no one away. Ezra expanded the operation again after the war. The railhead at Cumberland Gap now connected to the broader market, and the demand for quality smoked meat had only grown. The war had disrupted food supply chains across the South, and people who had survived on hardtack and salt pork for 4 years were hungry for something that tasted like craft and care. He built a proper trail up the mountain, wide enough for a wagon, with switchbacks that gentled the grade and stone-lined drainage ditches that kept the surface passable in wet weather. The trail alone took him and 2 hired men the better part of a summer to build, and it was a piece of engineering he was quietly proud of. Each switchback calculated to maintain a grade no steeper than 1 foot in 10, each culvert placed where water naturally wanted to flow. He constructed a timber frame building at the cave entrance, part storefront, part packing room, where meat could be wrapped in cheesecloth, weighed on a balance scale Clara had ordered from a catalog, and loaded for transport in the oak barrels she designed. The building had a broad porch that looked out over the valley, and on autumn mornings when the mist lay in the hollows and the ridges floated above it like islands, visitors would stand on that porch and understand why a man might choose to live in a place that everyone else had called worthless. By 1870, the Black Ridge Smokehouse, as people had begun calling it, was processing over 1,000 pounds of meat per month. Ezra employed 6 men full-time and took on apprentices each autumn, usually 2 or 3 young men from the mountain communities who came to learn his techniques in exchange for room, board, and a share of the product. He taught them everything: the brine ratios, the smoking schedules, the importance of airflow and temperature consistency, the difference between hickory smoke at 60 degrees and hickory smoke at 80, the way to judge a cure by pressing a thumb into the surface of the meat and reading the resistance. He showed them his notebooks and explained the science behind each step, how salt inhibited bacterial growth through osmosis, drawing moisture out of the meat and creating an environment hostile to the microorganisms that caused spoilage, how smoke contained natural preservatives, compounds including formaldehyde, acetic acid, and phenols that penetrated the meat surface and created a chemical barrier against decay, how the cave's stable environment eliminated the variables that ruined conventional cures, the temperature swings, the humidity fluctuations, the drafts and dead spots that produced uneven smoking and inconsistent results. He was generous with his knowledge in a way that surprised people who expected a man with a trade secret to guard it jealously. A pork buyer from Louisville once asked him why he didn't patent his method or at least keep the details to himself. Ezra considered the question and said, "A secret is a dead thing. It dies with the man who keeps it. But knowledge shared is a living thing. It grows and changes and becomes more than what it was. I'd rather have 50 men smoking meat well than be the only man who knows how." The apprentices who left his mountain carried his methods to their own communities, and in doing so they created demand for the original. People who tasted good smoked meat wanted better smoked meat, and the best still came from the cave on Black Ridge, where the stone breathed and the smoke drifted slow, and the earth kept its own steady counsel. His son Silas grew into a serious young man who shared his father's love of books and his mother's precision with tools. At 16, he could manage the smokehouse alone, and he had begun his own experiments, trying different combinations of wood and spice, testing longer and shorter cure times, keeping his own notebooks in a hand that echoed his father's. He was particularly interested in the cave's geology and spent hours exploring the deeper passages that Ezra had never fully mapped, returning with specimens of calcite crystal and fossil-bearing limestone that he arranged on shelves in the family's living chamber. Annette was different. Outward where Silas was inward, restless where he was patient. She loved the valley, the bustle of town, the company of people. At 18, she married a schoolteacher from Middlesbrough and moved down the mountain, though she returned every Sunday for dinner and never lost her taste for her father's smoked turkey. A third child, Thomas, arrived in 1862, during the war's darkest year. He was a quiet, watchful boy who seemed to absorb everything and say little, and who developed an early talent for drawing that Clara encouraged with paper and charcoal she ordered from Louisville. By the time he was 12, he was producing detailed illustrations of the cave system, cross-sections, floor plans, geological studies that were accurate enough to serve as technical documents. Clara herself had become something of a local authority on woodworking and furniture design. Women from 3 counties came to her for advice on repairs and construction, and she taught a Saturday class in the timber frame building at the cave entrance where she showed girls and young women how to use hand tools safely and well. She never charged for these lessons. She believed, as Ezra did, that skill was a form of wealth that grew richer when it was given away. Morris Tunstall died in 1874. He had lost the east parcel to the bank 5 years earlier and spent his final years living in a rented room above a dry goods store in Harlan, bitter and increasingly addled by drink. Ezra attended the funeral and stood quietly at the back of the small gathering. He felt no triumph. Morris had been cruel to him, but cruelty born of stupidity was more pitiable than hateful, and Ezra had long since stopped carrying the weight of his brother's contempt. Dalton survived longer but fared no better in spirit. Harriet had left him in 1867, returning to her family in Virginia with a trunk of clothes and a silence that was louder than any argument. Dalton had sold the west parcel piece by piece to pay his debts. First the timber stand, then the mill, then the bottomland itself, the dark, rich earth that 3 generations of Tunstall's had plowed. He lived alone in a 2-room cabin on the last scrap of Tunstall bottomland, 5 acres that no one wanted to buy, raising a few chickens and doing odd carpentry jobs for people who remembered his name. Ezra visited him once, in October of 1876, on a day when the valley was blazing with color, the maples burning red, the hickories gold, the oaks still holding their green as though reluctant to admit the year was turning. He found Dalton sitting on the porch in the thin autumn sun, wearing a coat that was too large for him now. He had shrunk. His hands, which had once been thick and sure, lay in his lap like tools someone had set down and forgotten. "You always were the smart one," Dalton said. "I was the curious one," Ezra corrected gently. "That's different." "Is it?" "Smart means you know the answers. Curious means you know the questions. I just kept asking questions until the mountain gave me something." They sat together for an hour without saying much else. They drank coffee that Ezra had brought in a tin flask, and they watched a red-tailed hawk making slow circles over the pasture, and the silence between them was not hostile, but simply the silence of 2 men who had traveled so far from where they started that there was no path back to common ground. Before he left, Ezra told Dalton he was welcome at Black Ridge any time, and meant it. Dalton looked at the mountain, the dark ridge visible above the tree line, the place his youngest brother had turned into something no one had imagined, and nodded slowly. He never came. By 1880, the Black Ridge Smokehouse was an institution. The meat was shipped as far as Lexington and Louisville, packed in oak barrels that Clara had designed with removable inner trays that kept the pieces separated and ventilated during transport. A small innovation that solved the age-old problem of smoked meats, sweating against each other in transit and developing off flavors. Each barrel was branded with a mark Clara had designed, the letters BRS, over a simple outline of a mountain burned into the oak with a heated iron. It became recognizable. Merchants in Louisville who stocked the barrels reported that customers would seek out the brand specifically, bypassing cheaper alternatives. A Louisville newspaper sent a reporter to write about the operation in 1882, and the resulting article, which described the cave in vivid detail, recounted Ezra's history with the sympathy that newspapers reserved for stories of self-made men, and called Ezra the philosopher of smoke. Brought visitors from as far away as Nashville, Cincinnati, and even Chicago. They came up the Switchback Trail on horseback or in rented buggies, and they stood in the smoking chamber with expressions of wonder that Ezra had long since ceased to find remarkable. To him, the cave was simply a workplace, as familiar as a kitchen, its rhythms and temperatures and smells as natural to him as breathing. Some came to buy, others came to learn. A few came simply to see, to stand in the presence of something that had been built by one man's hands and one man's patience, and to feel perhaps the quiet reproach that such places offer to a world increasingly obsessed with speed and scale. A professor of geology from the University of Kentucky, named Dr. Harold Whitfield, came in the autumn of 1884 to study the cave system itself. He was a tall, thin man with wire spectacles and an enthusiasm for limestone that bordered on the evangelical, and he spent 3 days mapping the passages with Thomas's help, measuring temperatures at various depths, collecting air samples in glass bottles, and crawling into crevices that Ezra had never bothered to explore. He confirmed what Ezra had observed empirically and recorded in his notebooks for over 30 years. The cave maintained a year-round temperature between 53 and 57 degrees Fahrenheit, with relative humidity between 65 and 75%. The airflow was driven by a phenomenon called the chimney effect, warm air from the cave's interior rising through fissures and small openings in the rock above, creating a pressure differential that drew air from the deeper passages forward through the main chamber and out the entrance. The draft was gentle but constant, averaging what Whitfield estimated was about 2 miles per hour. Barely enough to feel on the skin, but sufficient to move smoke evenly across the hanging meat. "You've been practicing applied geology for 30 years without knowing it," the professor told Ezra. "I knew it," Ezra replied. "I just didn't know what to call it." The professor also identified the natural saltpeter deposits that Ezra had been using in his brine. They were high-quality potassium nitrate, formed by the same biological processes that had produced saltpeter in caves throughout Kentucky for centuries, the same caves that had supplied gunpowder during the War of 1812 and the Civil War. Ezra's cave was, in geological terms, a classic Kentucky karst formation, a soluble limestone system shaped by water over millions of years, riddled with passages and chambers that maintained constant conditions regardless of the chaos of weather above. The professor published a paper about the cave in a scientific journal, citing Ezra's notebooks as primary data. It was the first time a working smokehouse had been studied as a geological system, and it drew attention from agricultural scientists who were beginning to study food preservation systematically. Ezra was 68 years old in 1888. His hair was white, his hands gnarled from decades of work, but his mind was sharp, and his step was steady on the mountain trails he had walked for 37 years. He still supervised the smokehouse each morning, checking the temperature, adjusting the draft, examining the hanging meat with the same careful eye he had brought to that first strip of venison in 1851. Silas had taken over the daily management of the business. He had expanded it thoughtfully, adding a second smoking chamber that he had carved deeper into the ridge, and introducing new products: smoked sausage, smoked cheese, and a cured bacon that had become the most requested item on the menu of a hotel in Lexington. He had also begun corresponding with food scientists in Europe, exchanging techniques with smokehouse operators in Germany and Denmark, who were working on the same problems of temperature control and consistent curing. Thomas had gone to art school in Cincinnati and returned as a skilled draftsman and illustrator. He was working on a book, a comprehensive guide to cave smoking technique, illustrated with his own detailed drawings, that he and Ezra discussed over supper each evening, reviewing methods and debating the finer points of brine chemistry and wood selection. Clara was 61 and showed no signs of slowing down. Her woodworking classes had grown into an informal school that served dozens of students each year, and she had begun designing and building furniture for sale: chairs, tables, and cabinets of such quality that they were sought after throughout eastern Kentucky. She used only local wood: cherry, walnut, and chestnut from the Black Ridge forests, seasoned in the cave's curing room, which she had discovered produced a slow, even drying that prevented the warping and checking that plagued conventionally dried lumber. The family ate supper together each evening at a table Clara had built of black walnut in the living chamber that Ezra had carved from stone nearly 4 decades before. The room was warm, it was always warm, and lit by oil lamps that threw soft shadows on walls that Clara had smoothed and whitewashed. Shelves held books, Silas's geological specimens, Thomas's drawings, and Annette's children's toys left behind after Sunday visits. It was a home built into the bones of the earth, and it was full. In the autumn of 1891, Ezra began to slow. He did not complain. That was not his way. But Clara noticed that he rested more often on the trail, that he sat longer at the supper table before rising, that he spent more time in his chair by the cave entrance, watching the valley below turn gold and crimson with the season. He was 71. The cough that had troubled him since August deepened in October. The doctor in Harlan, a young man who had not been born when Ezra first climbed Black Ridge, listened to his chest and said what doctors say when honesty is the only medicine left. Ezra received the news with the same quiet composure he had brought to every challenge of his life. He asked Clara to help him walk to the smoking chamber, and he stood there for a long time, watching the blue haze of hickory smoke drift on the cave's breath, rising past the hanging hams and bacon sides and turkey breasts, curling slowly toward the entrance and the autumn light beyond. "Still working," he said, and smiled. He spent his final weeks in the living chamber, propped up on pillows Clara had sewn from flour sacks, wrapped in a quilt Annette had brought from Middlesbrough. His children and grandchildren came and went. Silas, steady and sure. Annette, weeping and fierce. Thomas, sketching his father's face in charcoal with hands that trembled only slightly. On the evening of November 3rd, 1891, with the first snow of the season falling on Black Ridge, soft, heavy flakes that covered the oaks and laurels in white and muffled the world into silence, Ezra called his children to his bedside. The cave was warm. It was always warm. The oil lamp on the shelf threw a steady glow across the limestone walls, and the air carried the faint, sweet scent of hickory that had permeated the stone over 40 years of smoking. Clara sat beside him, holding his hand, her face composed and steady in the way of a woman who has already done her grieving in private and now intended to be present for what came next. Silas stood at the foot of the bed, his arms at his sides, his jaw set. Annette knelt beside her mother, pressing her face against the quilt. Thomas sat in the corner with his sketch pad closed on his knee, because some moments are not for drawing, but for witnessing. "Keep digging," Ezra said. His voice was quiet, but clear, each word placed with the deliberation of a man who had always chosen his words the way he chose his tools, carefully and only when needed. There's always more inside the mountain. There's always more than what you see. He looked at each of them in turn. Silas, who would carry the work forward. Annette, who would carry the warmth. Thomas, who would carry the story. Then he looked at Clara, and something passed between them that 40 years of partnership had made unnecessary to speak. He closed his eyes and did not open them again. They buried him on the ridge 2 days later, 50 yards from the cave entrance, under a chestnut oak that he had marked as his favorite tree the first week he arrived. The November light was thin and silver, and the snow had stopped, leaving the world clean and white and still. Half the town of Harlan made the climb up the Switchback Trail, along with people from Middlesbrough and Cumberland Gap, and hollows so remote they didn't have names. Farmers, merchants, apprentices, the children of families Clara had sheltered during the war. Fletcher came, 78 years old and walking with a cane, and stood at the grave without speaking for a long time. Clara chose the headstone, a slab of the same gray limestone that formed the cave walls, quarried from the ridge itself. Thomas carved the inscription in letters that were plain and deep. Cut to last. Ezra Tunstall, 1820 to 1891. he looked deeper. The Black Ridge Smokehouse continued for 3 more generations. Silas ran it until 1912, expanding the operation thoughtfully, never chasing scale for its own sake, but always improving the process. He added a second smoking chamber that he had carved deeper into the ridge, where the temperature held even steadier. And he introduced new products: smoked sausage seasoned with sage and red pepper, smoked cheese that aged in the cave's humidity for 6 months, and a cured bacon that became the most requested item on the breakfast menu of the Lexington Grand Hotel. He trained dozens of apprentices who carried the techniques to smokehouses throughout Appalachia and as far west as Missouri, and he maintained his father's notebooks with additions of his own, observations on curing times, experiments with new wood blends, calculations of airflow rates at different seasons. Thomas's book, The Cave Smoker's Art, was published by a Louisville printer in 1895. It was a beautiful volume, 280 pages of detailed instruction illustrated with Thomas's precise, elegant drawings, cross-sections of the cave system, diagrams of the firebox and flue design, step-by-step illustrations of butchering and brining and hanging techniques, and a fold-out geological map of the Black Ridge Formation that the University of Kentucky later used in its teaching. The book remained in print for 40 years and went through 6 editions, each updated by members of the Tunstall family. Food historians would later credit it as one of the foundational texts of American artisanal food preservation, a bridge between the folk knowledge of the frontier and the scientific approach that would come to dominate the field in the 20th century. Annette's grandchildren became teachers, doctors, lawyers, and farmers, and every one of them could tell you the proper ratio of salt to sorghum in a curing brine, and the reason why hickory smoke tastes different from apple. They scattered across Kentucky and beyond, but they came back to Black Ridge for holidays and reunions, climbing the switchback trail their great-grandfather had built, sitting on the porch of the timber frame building, and looking out over the valley while the warm breath of the cave drifted past them, and the autumn light turned the mountains to gold. Clara survived Ezra by 14 years, dying in 1905 at the age of 78. She spent those years teaching, building, and expanding the woodworking school that eventually bore her name. The Dietrich Tunstall School of Woodcraft operated from the timber building at the cave entrance, and at its peak served 40 students a year, mostly girls and young women from the mountain communities, though boys and men were welcome too. Clara taught hand tool technique, furniture design, wood selection and seasoning, and what she called the discipline of material. The idea that good work began not with the maker's intention, but with the wood's own nature, its grain and strength and character, and that the maker's job was to listen before cutting. The furniture she built, chairs and tables and cabinets of Kentucky cherry and black walnut, seasoned in the cave and joined with the German dovetails she had learned from her father, still exists in homes and museums throughout the region, recognized by the precision of its joinery and the quiet, unshowy perfection of its proportions. The cave itself endures. The smoking chambers have been idle since the 1940s, when the last of the Tunstall Smokehouse operators, Silas's grandson, a man named Ezra after his great-grandfather, closed the business in the face of modern refrigeration and industrial meat processing. The economics had shifted. What one man in a cave could do in 4 weeks, a factory could do in 4 days. The flavor was not the same, but flavor in the industrial age was a luxury rather than a necessity, and the world had grown impatient with things that took time. But the cave maintains its temperature, 55 degrees year after year, century after century, and the carved walls still bear the marks of Ezra's chisel, each stroke a sentence in a story written in stone. The firebox stands intact. The flue channels are clear. The natural draft still flows, steady and warm, from the deep passages to the entrance, carrying the mineral scent of limestone and the ghost of hickory smoke that has seeped so deep into the rock it may never fully leave. In 1978, the University of Kentucky returned to study the cave system. Researchers confirmed what Ezra had understood intuitively and what the 1884 survey had documented. The cave's combination of thermal stability, natural airflow, consistent humidity, and mineral-rich atmosphere created conditions that were, in the words of the lead geologist, essentially a natural precision environment for slow-curing organic material. Modern food scientists studying the revival of artisanal smoking techniques have cited Ezra's notebooks, now preserved in the university's special collections, as foundational documents in the history of American food preservation. The Black Ridge property remains in the Tunstall family. Ezra's great-great-granddaughter, who teaches environmental science at a college in Lexington, visits each autumn to walk the ridge and sit at the cave entrance, where the warm breath of the mountain still flows outward into the October air, carrying the faint scent of old stone and deep thyme. The earth gives what it gives. It does not care about deeds or inheritance or the opinions of brothers. It keeps its own counsel, holds its own warmth, and waits for someone patient enough to listen. Ezra Tunstall listened. He put his hands against the stone and felt the mountain breathing, and he understood that survival is not a battle against nature, but a conversation with it, steady, respectful, and long. 40 acres of worthless hillside, a cave no one wanted, and the patience to look deeper. That was enough. That was more than enough.